Ah, this theory, intriguing and disturbing. Are you ready to delve into the darkness surrounding the story of Snow White? Let's dive in. The theory that Snow White is dead in Disney's 1937 classic film is fascinating and filled with symbolism. The main idea is that Snow White, upon biting the poisoned apple, actually succumbs to death, and everything that follows is a metaphorical representation of her transition to the other side. At the moment Snow White bites the apple, the transition from life to death is clear but disguised by the euphemism of eternal sleep. The apple, which symbolizes sin and forbidden knowledge in Christian tradition, here becomes an agent of death. But notice something strange. Unlike other fairy tales where deaths are evident, the poisoning here is almost romanticized. The narrator describes the moment with unsettling calmness, as if Snow White's death were not a tragedy but a release. The apple falling from her hand after the first and only bite is symbolic, suggesting that the connection between her body and the world has already been severed. Sleep is a common metaphor in folklore for the transition to the afterlife. Why would she sleep forever and not wake up? As everyone believes. Here's the first point of the theory. The spell was never broken. Snow White had already died, but the story doesn't let us see this immediately. After biting the apple and falling into eternal sleep, Snow White is placed in a glass coffin by the dwarfs. At first glance, this seems like a noble gesture, a way to preserve her immaculate beauty. But under a darker perspective, the glass coffin carries profound and unsettling symbolism. The glass, transparent and fragile, is often associated with the spiritual, material separating visible and invisible worlds. In the context of the theory, it serves as a metaphorical barrier between life and death. Snow White is no longer alive but has not been fully released into the afterlife. She is trapped in a liminal state, like a spirit awaiting redemption or passage to another dimension. The dwarfs, gathered around the coffin, act as guardians, much like the living who cannot yet let go of their grief. They vigilantly watch over the coffin, refusing to bury her, as if they know her soul is still wandering, unable to find rest. There's something unsettling about this act, as it perpetuates the limbo in which Snow White is stuck. Moreover, the very fact that her body does not decompose is a supernatural sign. In folklore and religion, incorrupt bodies are often associated with martyrs or spiritual figures. Snow White, with her unaltered appearance, seems no longer to belong to the human world but also not to the dead. It is almost as if she is in a dome, suspended between the two worlds. Now, enter the prince, whose arrival changes the story's course entirely. At first glance, he appears to be the typical romantic hero, but there's something disturbingly surreal about his appearance. He emerges out of nowhere, with an inexplicable fascination for Snow White's figure in the coffin, as if he were destined to find her. Here, the theory suggests that the prince is not an ordinary man but a symbolic figure, a psychopomp. In folklore and mythology, psychopomps are entities that guide the souls of the dead to the afterlife. Their role is to help spirits cross the threshold between life and death, ensuring they find rest or their next existence. Notice the prince's behavior. He does not question how or why Snow White is in that state. He does not despair but acts with a supernatural calmness, as if he knows exactly what is happening. When he approaches the coffin, there's an aura of reverence in his gestures. The kiss he offers is not an act of resuscitation. He is not trying to bring her back to life. Instead, he awakens her to another state of existence, freeing her from her spiritual limbo. Another intriguing detail. The kiss doesn't make logical sense. How could a simple gesture break such a powerful spell? The explanation in the theory is that the kiss is not a physical act but a symbolic one, a kind of transitional ritual. At this moment, Snow White leaves the world of the living to follow the prince into the beyond. The concept of the prince as a spiritual guide can be compared to figures in medieval legends, where knights often played the role of leading maidens to heavenly realms. In some ancient versions of similar stories, the prince is described as coming from a distant realm, which can be interpreted as the other world. The evil queen's death, as cruel as it is theatrical, carries symbolism that transcends mere earthly punishment. In her relentless desire to destroy Snow White, the queen ends up meeting a fate that can be interpreted as a reflection of her own deeds. But what if her death were not just retribution for her wickedness? What if it represented something deeper in the cycle of life and death? When the queen discovers that Snow White still lives, she is consumed by despair. This moment is crucial to the theory because the queen is symbolically defeated not by the force of the living but by the resilience of the afterlife. By trying to interfere in what is already Snow White's transition to the other side, the queen triggers her own downfall. In the Brothers Grimm's original tale, the queen's death is brutal. She is forced to wear red-hot iron shoes and dance until she dies. This punishment, grotesque and ritualistic, seems less like revenge and more like spiritual adjustment. Fire, a symbol of purification, consumes the queen as if her body were being prepared for hell or an equivalent fate. In Disney's version, the queen is thrown off a cliff, crushed by a boulder. Still, the natural element, the cliff and the storm, suggests that cosmic forces conspired against her. It's almost as if the universe's balance demanded her soul be removed to allow Snow White to complete her journey to the other side. Another intriguing layer of the theory is the symbolic connection between the queen and Snow White. In many legends and mythologies, the confrontation between two feminine forces, one young and pure, the other old and corrupt, represents the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The queen's death would be the final obstacle for Snow White to completely transcend her condition. Some scholars believe that the queen's obsession with the magic mirror symbolizes her inability to accept the inevitable, death. The mirror, which shows the truth, can be interpreted as an oracle of life and mortality. When it confirms that Snow White is the fairest, it is really saying that youth and life belong to Snow White, while the queen marches inexorably towards decay and death. At the end of Disney's film, Snow White and the prince walk toward a distant castle, bathed in an ethereal light and floating on the horizon. For many, this seems to be just the typical happy ending of a fairy tale. But for those who look closer, something much deeper and darker is happening. The castle Snow White sees in the distance is not presented as an earthly construction. It is suspended among clouds, radiating a supernatural light. In various traditions and cultures, castles in elevated settings, mountains, skies, or inaccessible peaks, represent the afterlife or paradise. The idea that the castle symbolizes heaven is reinforced by the intense illumination, which seems to envelop the couple like a portal to another existence. The prince, in his almost divine figure, calmly leads her there. He does not speak, does not exalt himself. His presence is serene, as if he already knew this moment was inevitable. For the theory, this is a crucial point. The prince is not taking her back to life but completing her journey to eternal rest. The walk toward the castle suggests that Snow White has finally transcended her state of suspension. The prince's kiss was not a resurrection but permission for her to move forward. This explains why the dwarfs, who had vigilantly guarded her body until then, do not follow her. They represent the living, who must accept loss and allow the dead to move on to their destiny. The castle on the horizon, therefore, is not a physical home but a metaphor for eternity. Snow White's entrance symbolizes her acceptance of death and the conclusion of her cycle. When the dwarfs realize that Snow White cannot be revived, they make an unusual decision to place her in a glass coffin and keep her above ground, where they can constantly see her. This act reflects a form of mourning that borders on denial. They cannot bury her, as that would symbolize accepting her death. The coffin, transparent, allows them to see her, as if her physical presence were enough to ease the pain of her spiritual absence. However, this choice to not bury her creates a state of suspension. Snow White, in theory, cannot rest in peace because the living have not yet let her go. Each dwarf seems to play a symbolic role in the grieving process. For instance, Grumpy reflects the anger that many feel in the face of death, while Bashful symbolizes deep sadness and melancholy. Their unity around Snow White, day after day, resembles a continuous funeral ritual, an echo of ancient funerary traditions where the dead were watched over for days before being buried. In the theory, the dwarfs are not merely caricatured characters but representations of human emotions in the face of loss. Their devotion to Snow White is touching but also tragic. They are trapped in the past, unable to move on. The arrival of the prince marks the breaking point. When he kisses Snow White, the dwarfs initially seem hesitant but soon accept her departure. Handing over Snow White's body to the prince symbolizes the acceptance of the inevitable, the understanding that they cannot keep her among the living forever. This moment is powerful because the dwarfs finally stop being guardians of a body and become guardians of a memory. They let Snow White go, allowing her to complete her journey to the beyond. As Snow White moves toward the celestial castle alongside the prince, she finally leaves behind the suffering she endured in life. From the beginning, her existence was marked by persecution, envy, and attempts on her life. In death, she is freed from the pains of the earthly world. The castle, elevated and wrapped in light, symbolizes the promise of eternal rest, a reward for her purity and resilience. This perspective gives the ending a deeper tone. Instead of just being a victory over evil, the story becomes a spiritual journey, where death is the gateway to a better destiny. The eternal sleep, so feared by the living, is, in truth, a relief for Snow White, the true happily ever after. The idea that death can be a reward seems to contradict the typical values of fairy tales, but it is far from unique. In many ancient narratives, heroes reach a state of peace only after facing great trials and accepting their final destiny. Snow White, with her purity and suffering, aligns with these stories. Her death is not the end but the beginning of something greater, a new existence free from pain and persecution. This vision of Snow White's ending echoes many dark European tales. In the story of Sleeping Beauty, for example, some versions suggest that the princess's sleep is also a symbolic death, and her awakening marks the beginning of a new existence. Thus, the idea that happily ever after is achieved in death is deeply rooted in folklore.